if I'm paying $1,000 per month for child support, is that really being used on the child? And they start seeing things like the other former significant other quality of living goes up, they're spending it on maybe a new home or a car, suddenly they're like lavish purchases or taking trips, their clothing attire increases, and that really rubs people the wrong way. Hey everyone, are you someone concerned about child support? Are you concerned that you're paying too much support? You'd like to find ways to reduce your amount of child support or ways to even avoid paying child support? Well, then you're in good company. As a lawyer that practices family law, I get tons of questions about child support, and it makes sense, right? I understand why people are concerned about paying child support, because what happens is a court comes in and basically tells you that you will have to pay a certain amount of money per month and takes that control from you and takes it right out of your hands and now requires you to pay money to the other parent. So it's a really important conversation. Money means a lot in our world and to you, so I want to make sure to take time to give you today 7 tips, okay, on things that you can think about in child support scenarios that could help you to avoid child support altogether, reduce your support, just get greater control in the child support order. All right, so if I back up here for a moment, I'm talking about child support that comes in the context of family law matters between 2 parents, and for this conversation, we'll talk about where they have one child in common. And what happens is that people find themselves in scenarios where they are required to pay support, or they're being asked to pay child support, or they're just worried that they will have to pay child support and they don't know. And that's what brings me to tip number 1, okay? Tip number 1 is this. It revolves around marriage, all right? And we practice law in the state of Wisconsin. In the state of Wisconsin, children that are marital children are treated differently than children that are not marital, all right? And it's an important distinction, because if a child is born into a marriage, there is no child support order, right? You have 2 parents that are married, and there's just an automatic presumption that both parents are caring for the child and that both parents are financially supporting the child. That's while the parents are married, right? Now, that's different from a situation where a child is born outside of wedlock, and it's almost like there's a presumption that only one parent in Wisconsin is providing the care, that only one parent is providing financial support for the child. So the tip number 1 is this: get married, okay? That is a way to avoid a child support order, is by being married, right? It just makes sense, okay? So number 2 is somewhat closely related to that. If you're not married, you have a child with somebody, right? Well, what do we do next? One way to avoid a child support order when you have a child born outside of marriage is to live with the other parent. When you are living with the other parent, the presumption, what everyone will presume, is that you're living together, that any income that's coming into the household is coming into that one household and being provided to the child to help the child, right? So we will see that often, even when cases get started. Now we're in a situation where you're living together and it just doesn't make sense that we have a separate child support order. Number 3 is this. A lot of times we have people that are relying on government benefits, right? And they go and they apply for services. They're like, heck, it's free. You know, hey, if you're finding value in this video, send an email to me, Kyle@hkklawoffices.com. I'll send you our HKK divorce process worksheet. If I can get free daycare, might as well take it. If I can get free food share, food stamps, I'll take it. Once you do that, now you've entered into a system that is going to work against you, frankly, because you are getting these taxpayer-funded services. And what happens is a little trigger goes off and they say, well, wait a second, where are the support orders? Who's providing financial support in these situations? So if you make decisions ahead of time not to rely on those economic benefits for the child and for your household, okay, because it applies to the whole household, you'll put yourself in a better situation to avoid a child support order. But if you knowingly enter into that situation, and I get it, sometimes people don't have a choice in that, they need it, they need the economic benefits, But if you can avoid that and you can financially support yourself, do that, because otherwise when you enter into that, you are now widening your audience, right? And now the child support agency comes in and they want to get involved to make sure that there's a child support order in place that ensures that both parents are maximizing their efforts to financially support the child. Okay, so that's tip 3. Tip 4 deals with placement, all right? And what I'm talking about with placement now is the amount of time that the child spends with each parent. And if you are the primary parent, you have primary placement, that means you have 75% or more of the time, okay? So in a situation that often comes up, many cases over time in my 18 years where you have one parent having every other weekend, people will call it, or alternating weekends, that is a primary parent situation. That means in a 14-day cycle that one parent is having all of the overnights except for 2, right? So you want to be in that scenario because as the primary parent, you do not pay child support. So if you have how do I avoid child support? Be the primary parent. Do all the caretaking. Do most of it, right? So the other one, then getting us into now tip number 5, is if you're in a situation that you don't have primary parenting, you have the next level up, which is called shared parenting. Shared parenting time, shared placement, or equal and shared placement, we like to call it. So those are the 50-50 scenarios or the 70-30, 60-40, where the balance of time between overnight placement essentially is about the same or close to it. That is going to give you more control over your child support order. You may not be able to avoid paying child support in a shared placement or equal shared placement situation, but you're certainly going to balance it out much better. The amount that you would be ordered to pay is going to be better, right? So going back to the primary parent situation, that parent that has the every other weekend in the state of Wisconsin dealing with one child, they are going to pay 17% of their gross income. Okay, guys? Gross income means the gross income before taxes are taken out, contributions to 401ks, contributions to health insurance plans, things like that. 17% of that gross income. So if you're the non-primary parent in that situation, obviously you're going to want to find yourself in a placement situation that increases the amount of time so that the percentage that you pay goes down. The other thing that comes up is when we get into the shared placement, we're not only considering one parent's income, we're considering both parties' income, and there's a calculation that's done to determine what is fair and in the best interest of the child under the Wisconsin child support guidelines. All right, so that gets me to tip number 6, all right? Tip number 6, this one, I've seen this used, and I've seen it used effectively, right? So we have situations now where, let's say we're in shared placement, what I just talked about earlier. So we've got this shared placement situation, you're still paying child support, you just don't like it. You don't like the idea that the government, depending on how you're paid, taking money from your earnings every 2 weeks if you're paid every 2 weeks, or every week if you're paid weekly, or once a month if you're paid monthly. You just don't like it, right? And you don't like that it's a set amount, you'd like to have a little bit more control over that. So one thing that you may want to try to attempt to do is, rather than having a specific support order that essentially garnishes your wages, you want to take on the bulk of the other expenses, okay? And so what often happens is people will say, I'll pay for the health insurance, I'll pay for uninsured medical expenses, I will pay for variable expenses, and I will also offer to the other parent the ability, when it comes time to the tax season, to claim the child for the child tax exemption or the child tax credit, okay? Those tools I see used most often when people are trying to avoid child support orders. And that typically is a negotiation. And courts will support it when two parties come in and they say, look, here's the deal, Judge, we want you to support this because one parent is going to take on the bulk of the expenses while the other is relieved of that. It's a little bit of a gamble, right? Because what you're hopeful of is that the total amount that you pay annually to provide the health insurance, pay for uninsured medical expenses, pay the variable expenses, and give up that child tax credit and exemption is worth it, right? That you ultimately financially are better off in that situation than you are paying a regular child support amount, okay? Now, I think it's important here, maybe I could have done this earlier on in the video, I want to remind you that I've never worked with somebody that's come in and said, I don't want to help support my child. That's not what people are saying. And so when we talk about some of these situations and how to adjust support or maybe avoid support, it's not in the realm of like a parent not wanting to help financially support their child. A lot of times what they don't like is that they're giving up that control. They've handed over that money now to somebody else, to the other parent. And the other parent then is really essentially tasked with taking that bucket of money from the child support order and then using that for the child's purposes. And what most people are suspicious of, the people that are paying the support, are suspicious that if I'm paying $1,000 per month for child support, is that really being used on the child? And they start seeing things like, the other former significant other or spouse is like quality of living goes up. They're spending it on maybe a new home or a car. Suddenly they're like lavish purchases or taking trips. Their clothing attire increases, and that really rubs people the wrong way. And so they don't like that. They don't like that, right? And that's why we have these conversations where people are like, is there a better way for this child support to work? So when we talk about the variable expenses on tip number 6, the variable expenses can be tricky because variable expenses are the things that are above basic support and generally includes things like school registration, school supplies, registration fees for programs, sports, activities, clubs, things of that nature. And the problem with variable expenses is that by law in Wisconsin, both parents have to agree to the activity before the expense is incurred. So there's discussion that has to go back and forth on that, right? Like, I don't know, should our child join this soccer team and at this expense, and do we agree that that's a legitimate expense, right? So you could find yourself then in a situation where you're paying more than what you anticipated. You might find yourself a little bit conflicted because now you realize you got a high ticket to pay for an activity and you're making decisions to try to avoid that. So just be careful about that as you're thinking about the variable expenses. This gets me to tip number 7, and tip number 7 is truly the most important one in my opinion, all right? Tip number 7, I call it narrowing your audience, right? Narrow your audience. And what I mean by that is oftentimes people come to me and the struggle that they're having is with the other parent, and they're trying to figure life out. They're either unhappy with the quality of their life, they're frustrated in the lack of communication, and that can be a good or bad thing. In particular with child support, when we have a wider audience, and I'll tell you what that means here in a second. When we have a wider audience, your ability to control or create certainty on child support is less than with a narrow audience, all right? A narrow audience is when two parents are talking about a child support order and what that child support order should be, if any. A wider audience includes people like a child support attorney, it includes a judge, and even it could include a guardian ad litem at times who's weighing in on what's in the best interest of the child. And what happens is the wider our audience is, the more objective things become, and the less that the audience cares about the minute details of each party. So when you narrow your audience, if you're trying to reduce your child support, have no child support, eliminate it, if you can work with the parent on that and get an agreement in place, that is your most likely cleanest avenue to reducing support or avoiding it altogether. The only time that is a problem goes back up to one of my previous tips here on avoiding the government benefits, because the child support agency drops into that conversation and they make it much more difficult for that narrow audience because now it's been expanded. Okay, so this is why decision making and choices are really important. You want to plant the seeds today. Okay, I don't know if you have kids, you have one on the way, but you need to think about what you're doing financially currently, all right, so that you can exercise as much certainty or control in your environment to come up with an order that works well. Guys, those are my 7 tips for you as it relates to child support, ways potentially that you can reduce support or avoid it altogether. I hope you have some great takeaways from it. We'll see you next time on another video. Thanks.